His voice was pained. But I have orders. You are not authorized to enter the building. The world tilted. What are you talking about? I own this company. Not according to the paperwork I received this morning. He pulled out a document, official and stamped. As of 8 a.m. today, Derek Sutton is listed as sole owner and CEO of Blake Innovations. You've been removed from all access lists. Morgan's vision tunneled. The sunshine suddenly felt scalding. There's been a mistake. Call my assistant. Call anyone on the board. I tried, ma'am. They're all in an emergency shareholder meeting. Without you, she fumbled for her phone. Fingers numb. Dialed her CFO. Straight to voicemail. Her head of product. Voicemail. Her assistant of 3 years. Number disconnected. The email notification chimed. Subject line: personnel changes at Blake Innovations. Her hands shook as she opened it. The words swam, but their meaning was clear as poison. Effective immediately, Morgan Blake has been removed as Chief Executive Officer following a unanimous shareholder vote. Derek Sutton will assume all leadership responsibilities. This transition reflects the board's confidence in new leadership direction and addresses concerns about founder instability that have impacted company performance. Founder instability. Morgan's throat closed. She opened her banking app with fingers that felt disconnected from her body. Checking account $0. Savings account $0. Investment account access denied. Everything was gone. 10 years of work, $43 million, vanished between her morning coffee and the drive to work. She called Derek. It rang once before going to voicemail. Called again, same result. Sent a text, "What did you do?" The response came immediately. "I did what I had to do. You signed over everything this morning. Morgan, Blake Innovations is mine now. The house is mine. The accounts are mine. You're done." The phone slipped from her hands, clattering on the sidewalk. Jerry caught her elbow as she swayed. "Miss Blake, are you all right? Should I call someone?" But who could she call? Her lawyer worked for the company. Her accountant worked for the company. Her friends were investors or employees, all now controlled by Derek. She had $43 in her wallet and a dead phone. Morgan Blake, the woman Forbes called the most innovative mind in cybersecurity, stood on the sidewalk outside her own company and realized she had nothing. No access, no money, no allies. And somewhere in that penthouse, Derek Sutton was probably laughing. Morgan sat in her Tesla, hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. The car was probably the only thing she still owned, and only because it was parked on a public street when Derek's trap snapped shut. She pulled up the documents she'd signed that morning on her phone, using the building's guest Wi-Fi since her data plan was surely about to be canceled. The legal language was deliberately dense, but certain phrases jumped out like accusers. Complete transfer of all shares and ownership rights. Irrevocable assignment of intellectual property. Acknowledgement of full compensation received. She'd signed away her entire company, not just her shares. Everything. The patents, the software, the brand, even her own name on the door. Her phone buzzed. An alert from the DMV. Vehicle registration for Tesla Model S transferred to Derek Sutton. Effective immediately. So much for her last possession. Morgan started driving with no destination, just movement to keep from screaming. She ended up at the one place she'd always felt safe, her childhood home in Noe Valley, where her mother still lived in the little Victorian Morgan had bought her 5 years ago. Elizabeth Blake answered the door with a confused smile, her silver hair escaping from its usual neat bun. At 68, she still had the sharp eyes of the high school principal she'd been before retirement. But lately, those eyes had been fogging over. Doctor's appointments, memory tests, the word dementia hovering unspoken in sterile examination rooms. "Can I help you?" Elizabeth asked politely, like Morgan was a stranger selling something. "Mom, it's me. It's Morgan." Her mother's face showed only pleasant confusion. "I'm sorry, dear. Do we know each other?" The ground opened up. This wasn't one of her small episodes. This was total blank erasure. Morgan stumbled inside, her mother following nervously, and found the medication bottles on the kitchen counter. New prescriptions, filled yesterday, names she didn't recognize. She called her mother's doctor. The receptionist was apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, but Dr. Matthews can only discuss patient information with approved family members. According to our records, that's Derek Sutton. who's listed as Elizabeth Blake's primary caretaker and medical proxy. Since when? The paperwork was filed last week. Everything was connected. Every piece of Morgan's life had been systematically dismantled while she'd been too busy celebrating her funding round to notice the walls closing in. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it desperately. Morgan Blake, a woman's voice, professional and cold. This is Margaret Foster from Whitman and Associates. I'm calling to inform you that our firm is terminating our representation effective immediately. All files related to your personal and business matters have been transferred to your husband as requested. Derek isn't my husband anymore, and I never requested. The paperwork says otherwise. Best of luck, Miss Blake. Click. Morgan tried her other lawyers, her accountants, her financial advisors. Same script, same betrayal. Derek had systematically contacted everyone in her professional network, armed with documents she'd unknowingly signed, and cut her off completely. She sat in her dead mother's kitchen, watching Elizabeth putter around making tea for a stranger, and felt something inside her crack. Not break, crack, like ice over deep water. Her phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number containing a video file. Against every instinct, she opened it. The footage showed her at a restaurant 3 weeks ago, slamming her hand on the table during what she remembered as a passionate discussion about product strategy. Without audio, it looked violent. Cut to her throwing a stapler in her office last month. She'd been aiming for her trash can and missed, laughing at her own terrible aim. Edited tightly, it looked unhinged. More clips. Her crying in her car after a brutal investor meeting, yelling at her computer when it crashed, drinking wine alone on her balcony. 6 months of footage, carefully edited to paint a picture of a woman spiraling. The text that followed was from Derek. The board found your behavior concerning. This is why they voted you out. Don't fight this. Morgan, you'll only embarrass yourself. Move on quietly, and maybe I'll let you keep something. She tried to reply, but the message wouldn't send. Number blocked. Morgan looked up at the ceiling of her childhood home, where she dreamed of building something that mattered, where her father had told her before he died that she could do anything if she worked hard enough. She'd believed him, built an empire on that belief, and now a man she'd loved had stolen it all with a smile and a pen. Her mother appeared with tea, setting it down gently. You look upset, dear. Bad day. Morgan couldn't speak, could only nod. Well? Elizabeth said with the wisdom of someone who'd forgotten the present but remembered the past. My mother used to say the worst days teach us who we really are. Maybe you needed to lose everything to figure out what you're actually made of. Then she wandered away, humming something Morgan recognized from childhood, leaving her daughter alone with cold tea and a truth sharp as knives. She had nothing. No company. No money. No home. No allies. Her own mother didn't know her. Morgan Blake pulled out her phone and opened her contact list, started calling every name, friends from Stanford, former colleagues, industry connections. The calls all went the same way. Voicemail. Or worse, answered and immediately disconnected. Or worst of all, answered with excuses. Morgan, I heard about the board decision. I think it's best if we maintain some distance right now. I'm sorry, but Derek's become a major investor in my company. I can't be seen supporting you. You should have been more careful about your mental health. Everyone knew you were burning out. One by one, her bridges burned. Derek had been thorough. As the sun set over San Francisco, painting the fate orange and gold, Morgan sat in her car with a dead phone and exactly $43. The Tesla screen showed a new message: vehicle remote shutdown initiated. Please return to registered owner. She had 2 minutes before the car locked her out forever. Morgan grabbed her laptop bag and purse, stepped onto the sidewalk, and watched her last possession go dark. The city glittered around her, indifferent and beautiful. Somewhere in a penthouse, Derek was probably celebrating, planning his first moves as CEO of her company, maybe calling Vanessa to toast his victory. She found herself walking toward the Golden Gate Bridge, not because she wanted to jump, but because she needed to see something bigger than her disaster. Needed perspective from something permanent and strong. A homeless veteran sat near the bridge entrance, his cardboard sign asking for help. Morgan gave him her last $43. He looked surprised. You sure, miss, you look like you might need this. I needed it 5 hours ago. Now it won't make a difference. She kept walking, and somewhere behind her, the veteran called out, whatever you lost, build it back better. That's what I'm doing. Morgan stopped, turned. How? When you have nothing. He smiled, gap-toothed and genuine. Nothing means nobody can take anything else. You're finally free. The words hit like revelation. Derek had taken everything except the one thing he couldn't touch. Her mind, her skills, the 10 years of knowledge she'd built creating Blake Innovations. She couldn't fight him in court, couldn't fight him with money, but maybe, just maybe, she could fight him with truth. Morgan turned away from the bridge and started walking back toward the city. Her city, the place where she'd built an empire once, where she could build one again. But first, she needed to survive the night. And for that, she needed help from the one person who'd never let her down. Kate Brennan lived in a studio apartment in the Tenderloin, the kind of place that smelled like old coffee and ambition. When she answered Morgan's knock at 9 p.m., her face cycled through shock, concern, and immediate action. Get inside. Kate pulled her in, locked 3 deadbolts. I've been calling you all day. Your number's disconnected. Derek disconnected everything. Morgan collapsed on the futon that served as Kate's couch in bed. Kate, I have nothing, no money, no place to sleep. He took it all. Kate disappeared into her tiny kitchen, returning with whiskey and mismatched mugs. Drink this, then tell me everything. Well, they'd been roommates at Stanford before Morgan dropped out to start Blake Innovations. Kate had stayed, finished her journalism degree, and spent the last decade building a reputation as the reporter corporations feared. Investigative journalism didn't pay well. But Kate didn't care about money. She cared about truth. Morgan told her story while Kate took notes in the reporter's shorthand she'd never abandoned. When Morgan finished, Kate was quiet for a long moment. How much do you know about Derek's past? Kate finally asked. We've been together 5 years. I know everything. Do you know about Heather Chen, Miranda Park, or Susan Rodriguez? Morgan frowned. No, who are they? Kate opened her laptop, pulling up files she'd been compiling for months. 3 women, 3 tech startups, all had their companies stolen by men they trusted. Heather lost her biotech firm 4 years ago. Miranda lost her clean energy company 3 years ago. Susan lost her fintech startup 18 months ago. She turned the screen toward Morgan. 3 women's faces stared back, their expressions haunted. What happened to them? Heather's in therapy, working retail. Miranda moved back to Ohio, living with her parents. Susan? Kate's voice dropped. Susan killed herself 6 months ago. Jumped off the Bay Bridge. The whiskey turned to acid in Morgan's stomach. What does this have to do with Derek? Look at the men who took their companies. Kate pulled up more photos. Morgan's blood turned to ice. Different names, different faces. But the bone structure was similar enough. Derek had changed his appearance 3 times, stolen 3 companies, destroyed 3 women. He's done this before, Morgan whispered. This is what he does. It's worse than that. Kate pulled up more files. I've been investigating a corporate theft ring for 2 years, small enough to stay under FBI radar, sophisticated enough to be nearly untraceable. They target self-made founders, usually women, usually in tech. Get close, gain trust, then execute complex legal maneuvers to steal everything. Who's running it? That's what I've been trying to figure out. The stolen companies all get absorbed into a venture capital firm called Rivers Capital Group, run by Tom Rivers. Morgan's voice was flat. My mentor from Stanford, the man who gave me my first seed funding. Kate nodded slowly. I think Derek was hired to target you specifically. Your AI security software is worth billions. Rivers Capital has been trying to acquire you for years. I turned down their acquisition offers 4 times. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. So they sent Derek to take it instead. There's more. Kate pulled up bank records. 3 weeks ago, someone paid $200,000 to a shell company. The same shell company that previously paid off judges, lawyers, and even police officers to look the other way during the other thefts. Morgan stood, pacing the tiny apartment. How do we prove this? We can't, not yet. Every woman who's tried to fight back has been destroyed. They have too much money, Too many connections. Susan tried to go public, and they buried her in lawsuits Kate trailed off, until she jumped off a bridge. Morgan felt the weight of it. She could be next. Another statistic. Another woman who built something beautiful and had it stolen by men who felt entitled to her work. There has to be a way to fight this, Morgan said. If we have evidence of a pattern, evidence that I can't publish without getting sued into oblivion, evidence that would take years to investigate properly. Morgan, these people are good at what they do. They've perfected the system. A knock at the door made them both freeze. Kate checked at the peephole and then relaxed slightly. It's Dr. Cross. She opened the door to reveal a man in his 40s, carrying a laptop bag and looking nervous. Evan Cross was a forensic accountant Kate had worked with on previous investigations. I came as soon as I heard. He set his laptop on Kate's kitchen counter. Morgan, I'm sorry about what happened, but I think I can help. How about? Morgan asked. I've been quietly auditing Rivers Capital for the SEC. Nothing official yet, just preliminary investigation. But I found something interesting buried in their subsidiary transactions. He pulled up spreadsheets dense with numbers. Derek Sutton has been embezzling from Blake Innovations for 6 months. Small amounts, hidden in operational expenses. But it adds up to over $2 million. Why would he embezzle from a company he was planning to steal? Kate asked. Because he didn't know if the theft would work, Evan explained. This was his backup plan. If he couldn't steal the company legally, he'd at least walk away with cash. Morgan leaned closer to the screen. Can we use this report him to the SEC? I can file a report. But Morgan, you need to understand something. The moment I do that, Rivers Capital will know someone's investigating. They'll bury everything, destroy evidence, maybe even come after the three of us. I don't care, Morgan said. I've already lost everything. What else can they take? Kate and Evan exchanged looks. Your freedom, Kate said quietly. They could frame you for the embezzlement, or worse. Morgan thought about Susan Rodriguez, about the Bay Bridge, about how easy it would be to make another woman's death look like suicide. So what do we do, she asked. Just let them win. No. Kate's voice hardened with determination. We build an airtight case, document everything, find more victims, get evidence they can't destroy. Then we expose them all at once, publicly, in a way they can't control. That could take months, Morgan protested. Meanwhile, Derek's running my company into the ground and her phone buzzed. The spare phone Kate had lent her. A text from an unknown number. Stop investigating or the journalist dies next. We know where she lives. They all stared at the message. Kate's face went pale. They're watching us, Evan whispered. How did they know Morgan was here? Morgan checked the phone Kate had given her. It was an old Android, nothing fancy. But when she pulled up the settings, she found spyware installed. The phone was compromised before you gave it to me. Impossible. I bought it yesterday at a random store. Paid cash. Kate stopped. They're that deep. They knew I'd help you. They were waiting. The implications crashed over them. Rivers Capital had resources beyond anything they'd imagined. Eyes everywhere. Reach into everything. We need to leave, Evan said, already packing his laptop. If they know we're meeting, they might. The lights went out. All of them. Throughout the building. Emergency lights flickered on in the hallway outside. Fire alarm will trip in 3, 2. The alarm screamed to life. They're flushing us out, Kate said, making us visible. Morgan grabbed Kate's arm. Is there another way out? Fire escape, but it leads to an alley. And if they're watching, then we split up. Evan interrupted. 3 different exits, 3 different directions. Make them choose who to follow. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only plan they had. As they prepared to run, Morgan felt the crack inside her widen. Derek hadn't just stolen her company. He'd trapped her in a game where the rules were written to ensure she'd lose, where fighting back meant putting everyone she cared about in danger. She thought about the homeless veteran's words. You're finally free. But what good was freedom if you were running for your life? Charlotte Hayes worked in a glass tower downtown, the kind of law firm where junior partners drove Porsches and Mercy was billable at $600 an hour. Morgan had avoided calling Charlie until now. reluctant to drag her childhood best friend into the disaster. But after escaping Kate's apartment through 3 different exits and spending the night in a 24-hour diner, Morgan was out of options. Charlie's assistant tried to brush her off. "Miss Hayes is in a meeting. Tell her Morgan Blake is here. Tell her it's an emergency." 5 minutes later, Charlotte Hayes emerged from her corner office, her designer suit and perfect blonde bob unchanged since high school. She took one look at Morgan, grabbed her arm, and pulled her into a conference room. "You look like hell," Charlie said. "What happened?" Morgan told the story for the 3rd time in 24 hours. Charlie listened without interrupting, her lawyer's face revealing nothing. When Morgan finished, Charlie was quiet for a long moment. "I believe you, she finally said. "But belief isn't evidence. What do you have?" "Evan Cross found proof Derek embezzled from Blake Innovations. Kate Brennan has evidence of a pattern linking him to Rivers Capital. And I have—" Morgan stopped. What did she have? Memories of signing papers she hadn't read, a video of herself edited to look unstable. "I have nothing that would hold up in court." Charlie pulled out her phone, typing rapidly. "I'm filing an emergency injunction. We'll freeze Derek's access to Blake Innovations accounts, prevent him from making major decisions until we can review the transfer documents you signed. Can you do that?" "I can try. But Morgan, you need to understand something. The documents you signed this morning have been filed with the state. They're legal and binding. You transferred ownership voluntarily. Breaking that will require proving fraud, coercion, or mental incompetence at the time of signing." "I wasn't incompetent. I was trusting." "Legally, Baron, there's no difference." Charlie's voice was gentle but firm. "We'll argue the fraud angle. Say Derek misrepresented what you were signing, but he'll claim you're a sophisticated business owner who should have read before signing. It'll be your word against his." Morgan felt the ground shifting again. "What are my chances?" "Honestly, 20%. Maybe less." Charlie saw Morgan's face crumple and quickly added, "But we fight anyway. I'll file the injunction today. We'll request a full audit of Blake Innovations' finances. If Evan's right about the embezzlement, we might be able to prove Derek obtained ownership through fraudulent means. How long will that take? Months, maybe a year." Charlie leaned forward. "Morgan, you need to prepare yourself. This is going to be brutal. Derek has resources now. Your resources. He'll bury us in motion and countersuits. And if Rivers Capital is really behind this, they'll make it even worse." A knock at the conference room door. Charlie's assistant looked nervous. "Miss Hayes, there are 2 police officers here. They're asking for Morgan Blake." Morgan and Charlie exchanged looks. "What for?" Charlie asked. "They have a warrant for her arrest. Charges of embezzlement and corporate fraud." The room spun. Charlie stood immediately. "Don't say anything. Let me handle this." Officer Davis and Officer Brennan entered, their faces apologetic but firm. "Morgan Blake, you're under arrest for embezzlement of funds from Blake Innovations and filing fraudulent financial statements with the SEC." "That's absurd," Charlie snapped. "She's the victim here, not the criminal. We have evidence." Officer Davis showed them a tablet displaying bank records, transfers from Blake Innovations to personal accounts in Morgan's name, accounts she'd never opened. $2.3 million moved over 6 months. Morgan stared at the evidence Evan had found, now twisted against her. Derek had been embezzling using her identity. When Evan reported it to the SEC, Derek must have flipped the narrative, made her the criminal. "I didn't open those accounts," Morgan said. "I didn't make those transfers." "You can explain that to the judge," Officer Brennan said, not unkindly. "But right now, we need you to come with us." Charlie grabbed her briefcase. "I'm coming with her, and I'll have her out on bail within hours." But Charlie was wrong. The bail hearing happened that afternoon in a courthouse that smelled like anxiety and floor polish. Judge Patricia Winters presided, her expression carved from stone. The prosecutor laid out the charges: $2.3 million in embezzlement, false statements to federal investigators, potential flight risk given defendants' financial resources. "Your Honor, my client has no resources," Charlie argued. "She's been the victim of an elaborate fraud, a fraud she allegedly perpetrated." The prosecutor interrupted. The defendant signed an illegal document and is transferring her company just this morning, then immediately tried to reverse the transfer when investigators discovered her embezzlement scheme. This is clearly an attempt to avoid consequences. Judge Winters looked at Morgan over reading glasses. Miss Blake, do you have anything to say? Morgan stood, her voice steadier than she felt. Your Honor, I built Blake Innovations from nothing. It's my life's work. I would never steal from my own company. Someone is framing me, and I'm asking for the chance to prove it. The judge's expression didn't change. Bail is set at $500,000. Next, $500,000. Morgan couldn't scrape together $500. Charlie worked frantically on her phone as they led Morgan to a holding cell. I'm calling in favors. We'll get you out. But hours passed, then a day. Charlie came back with devastating news. Every bail bondsman in the city has been contacted by someone claiming you're a flight risk. They won't touch your case. I've tried to put up my own assets as collateral, but the judge wants cash only. Rivers Capital, Morgan whispered. They're making sure I stay locked up. I won't stop fighting, Charlie promised. I'm filing motions, requesting expedited hearings. But Morgan, you need to prepare for the possibility that you'll be here for weeks, maybe longer. That night, alone in a cell that smelled like bleach and despair, Morgan understood the game completely. Rivers Capital wasn't just stealing her company. They were destroying her credibility, her freedom, her future. By the time she got out, if she got out, Blake Innovations would be gone, absorbed into their portfolio. Just another acquisition. She thought about the other women. Heather, Miranda, Susan. Had they sat in cells like this, watching their empires crumble while lawyers filed motions that went nowhere? The crack inside her widened. Not quite breaking, but close. A guard appeared at her cell. Blake, you have a visitor. Morgan expected Charlie. Instead, Tom Rivers walked into the visiting room, impeccably dressed, his silver hair perfect. The man who'd been her actor, who'd believed in her when venture capitalists laughed at a 22-year-old dropout, who'd written the first check that made Blake Innovations possible. Hello, Morgan. He sat across from her, separated by bulletproof glass. You're looking tired. What do you want, Tom? To offer you a deal. He folded his hands, the picture of benevolence. Drop all this nonsense about fraud and conspiracy. Accept that you made bad business decisions. Sign a statement saying Blake Innovations was transferred fairly. Do that, and I'll make the criminal charges disappear. You'll walk out of here today and let you keep my company. It's not your company anymore. You signed it away, but I'm willing to be generous. I'll give you $5 million, enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere far from San Francisco. Morgan looked at this man she'd once admired, saw him clearly for the first time. You planned this from the beginning. The seed funding, introducing me to Derek. All of it, Tom smiled. I saw potential in your technology. You were brilliant but naive. I simply created the circumstances for that technology to reach its full potential under proper management. By destroying me, by removing an obstacle. His voice hardened. You're not the first founder to lose control of their company, Morgan, and you won't be the last. This is how the game works. The strong take from the weak. I'm giving you a chance to walk away with something. Take it. And if I don't, then you'll rot here while your mother's dementia worsens without treatment, while your company gets dismantled, while your name becomes synonymous with fraud and embezzlement. I have resources you can't imagine. Judges who owe me favors. Prosecutors on my payroll. You cannot win this fight. Morgan met his eyes, saw the absolute confidence there. He'd done this before, perfected the system, knew every loophole, every pressure point. $5 million, Tom repeated. Your freedom, your mother's care. All you have to do is stop fighting. For one terrible moment, Morgan considered it. Survival over pride, pragmatism over justice. $5 million was more than most people made in a lifetime. She could disappear, start over, forget Blake Innovations ever existed. Then she thought about Susan Rodriguez, about the Bay Bridge, about how surrendering felt like death by inches. No, Morgan said quietly. I won't stop fighting. Tom's expression didn't change. He simply stood, adjusted his cuffs, Then you've chosen poorly. I gave you a gift. Morgan. I gave you a way out. What happens next is on you. He walked away, and Morgan sat alone in the visiting room, understanding she'd just declared war on a man who owned the battlefield. Morgan spent 3 days in county jail before Charlie managed to convince Judge Coleman, a different judge, to review the bail decision. He reduced it to $50,000, which Charlie immediately posted using her retirement savings. "You're paying me back," Charlie said as they walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunshine that felt like forgiveness. "With interest. If I ever have money again," Morgan breathed free air, feeling like she'd been underwater for years instead of days. Charlie drove her to a motel in Daly City, the kind of place that rented rooms by the week and didn't ask questions. "Stay here, don't contact anyone, don't use your phone. I'm working on the case. But Morgan, I need you to understand something." They sat in the parking lot, seagulls crying overhead. "Tom Rivers contacted my firm." Charlie continued. "He's offering a very lucrative retainer for corporate work. My partners want me to drop you as a client. They say you're a liability." Morgan's stomach sank. "Are you going to?" "No, but I might lose my job over this. I needed you to know that." "Charlie, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. We've been friends since we were 8 years old. You taught me to stand up to bullies in 3rd grade. This is just a bigger bully." Charlie smiled, but her eyes were worried. "Besides, I looked into Rivers Capital. The more I dig, the worse it gets. This isn't just corporate theft. It's systematic destruction of female entrepreneurs. Someone needs to stop them. Even if it costs you everything. Especially then." Charlie squeezed her hand. "Now rest. I'll call you when I have updates. And Morgan, don't do anything stupid." But stupid was relative. That night, Morgan sat in the motel room with Kate's old laptop, researching everything she could find about Rivers Capital. The venture capital firm had been operating for 15 years, quietly acquiring small startups, most founded by women or minorities. The pattern was clear once you looked for it. Her phone buzzed. "Kate's number." Morgan answered cautiously. "I found something," Kate said without preamble. "Another victim, Rachel Montgomery. She lost her medical device company to Rivers Capital 2 years ago. But unlike the others, she fought back, got a lawyer, took them to court. What happened? She lost, but she documented everything. I met with her today. Morgan. She has evidence, real evidence. Emails from Tom Rivers explaining the scheme, financial records showing payments to Derek and others like him. She tried to use it in court, but the judge ruled it inadmissible on technical grounds." Morgan's heart raced. "Can we use it?" "Not in court, but we can use it publicly. If we release everything at once, media coverage might force authorities to investigate. It's risky, though. Rachel was sued into bankruptcy for breaking an NDA. She's living with her sister now, working as a waitress. I want to meet her." They met the next day at a diner in Oakland. Rachel Montgomery was 45, her face lined with exhaustion and anger. She slid a flash drive across the table. "Everything's on here," Rachel said. "Emails, financial records, even recordings of Tom explaining how he targets emotional female founders who are easy to manipulate. He said it to my face. Morgan said women are better victims because we're conditioned to trust." Morgan plugged the flash drive into the laptop. Hundreds of files, years of evidence. Why didn't this work in court? Because Tom's lawyers argued I obtained the emails illegally. Hacking, corporate espionage. Never mind that they were emails sent to me. The judge bought their argument. Rachel's hands shook as she lifted her coffee. "They destroyed my reputation, my credit, my ability to work in the industry. I'm telling you this so you know what you're up against." "I'm already destroyed," Morgan said. "What else can they take?" "Your hope." Rachel met her eyes. "That's what they really steal. Not the companies, the belief that the system works, that justice exists. I spent 2 years fighting, and I lost everything, including my faith that good people win." Kate leaned forward. "But if we go public with this, Rachel, if we expose the pattern, they'll bury you in lawsuits, destroy your credibility, maybe even—" Rachel stopped, but they all knew what she meant. "Maybe even kill you, like Susan." Morgan looked at the flash drive. heavy with truth that courts wouldn't hear. What if we didn't go through courts? What if we exposed them somewhere they couldn't control? Where? Kate asked. An idea formed, dangerous and desperate. Blake Innovations is presenting our new AI security platform at TechCrunch Disrupt next week. It's the biggest tech conference of the year. 10,000 attendees. Press from everywhere. What if we hijacked the presentation, showed this evidence on the main stage? Security would stop you in seconds, Rachel said. Not if I hacked the presentation remotely. Morgan pulled up TechCrunch's conference's schedule. I built Blake Innovations' security system. I know every backdoor, every vulnerability. I can access their presentation from outside the building. Kate was already typing on her phone. I can get press credentials. Make sure journalists are ready to cover whatever you reveal. But Morgan, this is a one-shot move. If it fails, you'll be charged with hacking, corporate sabotage, maybe terrorism. They'll put you away for decades. And if we do nothing, Rivers Capital keeps destroying women like us. Morgan looked at Rachel. How many more after me? How many more Susans? Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. I'll help. I'm a hardware engineer. If you need someone to physically access the conference center's network, I can do it. I'll coordinate the press angle, Kate said. Make sure this goes viral before they can contain it. They spent the next hour planning. Morgan would hack the presentation system. Rachel would create a physical backdoor in the conference center's network. Kate would alert every journalist she knew. And Charlotte would file a massive lawsuit the moment the evidence went public, using media attention to force the courts to pay attention. It was a sign, probably illegal, definitely dangerous, but it was the only move they had left. As they prepared to leave, a man approached their table, mid-40s, wearing an expensive suit, carrying himself with quiet authority. Morgan Blake. Morgan tensed. Who's asking? My name is Evan Cross. I'm the forensic accountant who found the embezzlement evidence. He sat down without being invited. I need to tell you something. The evidence I gave the SEC, it was altered before I could testify, changed to implicate you instead of Derek. I tried to come forward, but I was threatened. My family was threatened. Why are you here now? Kate demanded. Because I can't live with myself if I don't fix this. Evan pulled out his own flash drive. I made copies. The original evidence showing Derek embezzled. Not you. And more. I've been investigating Rivers Capital for 6 months. I have financial records showing they've stolen 43 companies, $2.6 billion in total value. All of it funneled through offshore accounts and shell corporations. Morgan stared at the flash drive. This could prove everything. It could also get us all killed, Evan said bluntly. Tom Rivers has connections to people who make problems disappear. I'm risking my life showing you this, but I'm tired of watching good people get destroyed while I hide behind professional ethics. Rachel reached across the table, taking the flash drive. Then we use it all, every piece of evidence. We make the exposure so big, so public, that killing us would only prove our point. They looked at each other. 4 people who'd lost everything. 4 people with nothing left but the truth and one desperate plan. TechCrunch Disrupt is in 6 days, Morgan said. We have 6 days to prepare the most important presentation of our lives. Not about AI security, about how an entire system is rigged to steal from people like us. Kate raised her coffee cup. To burning it all down, they clinked cups, ceramic against ceramic, sealing a pact that would either save them or destroy them completely. Outside the diner, a car sat in the parking lot, windows tinted dark. Inside, someone took photos of the 4 conspirators and sent them to a secure number with a simple message. They're planning something. Orders. The response came immediately. Let them try, then bury them. The motel room in Daly City became War Room Central. Morgan spread her laptop across the bed, surrounded by energy drinks and Kate's investigative files. Rachel sat at the desk, soldering equipment she'd bought from Radio Shack with cash. Evan worked through financial spreadsheets on his tablet. Kate paced while making calls to journalist contacts. We need to be smart about this, Evan said, pulling up a timeline. TechCrunch starts in 5 days. Blake Innovations presents on day 2, afternoon session. That gives us 5 days to prepare everything. Morgan pulled up the conference center's network diagram. I can access their presentation system remotely, but I'll need Rachel inside to create a physical connection. Conference center security is tight. How do we get you in? Catering staff, Rachel suggested. I worked food service through college. I can blend in. Kate stopped pacing. I've got press credentials approved. I'll be in the audience with 6 other journalists I trust. The moment you start the presentation, we go live on social media, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Make it impossible to contain. What about the legal side? Morgan asked. The second we do this, Rivers Capital will sue for everything. Let them sue. Charlie's voice came through speakerphone. She was working late at her firm, preparing documents. I'm filing a class action lawsuit on behalf of all Rivers Capital's victims the moment your presentation goes live. 43 companies, 43 plaintiffs will overwhelm their legal team. Evan highlighted cells in a spreadsheet. I've documented every dollar, where it came from, where it went, shell companies in the Caymans, Luxembourg, Singapore. Tom Rivers personally profited over $300 million from these thefts. Morgan stared at the number. $300 million stolen from people who'd built something from nothing. How is he not in prison? Because he's careful and connected. Evan pulled up more files. I found payments to judges, prosecutors, even SEC investigators. Small amounts, disguised as consulting fees or speaking engagements, enough to create conflicts of interest. Then we need to make this so public that those connections become liabilities. Kate said, I'm reaching out to 60 Minutes, the New York Times, Bloomberg. If we can get major media committed to covering this live, they won't commit without seeing evidence first. Rachel interrupted. And the moment we show evidence, word gets back to Rivers. They sat in frustrated silence. The plan had a fatal flaw. They needed media attention to protect themselves. But seeking that attention would alert their enemies. Morgan's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. Morgan Blake, a woman's voice, older, authoritative. My name is Patricia Winters. I'm the judge who set your bail at $500,000. Morgan's blood froze. Your Honor, I'm not supposed to be contacting. I'm contacting you, and this conversation never happened. Papers rustled in the background. I need you to understand something. The bail decision wasn't mine. I was instructed to set it prohibitively high, instructed by people I can't refuse without destroying my career. Tom Rivers. I can't confirm that, but I can tell you that you're not the first person I've been forced to railroad, and I'm tired of being his instrument. A pause. Well, there's a reason I'm calling. In 2 days, I'm retiring. After 30 years on the bench, I'm done. And before I go, I'm going to do one good thing. What? Morgan hardly dared breathe. I'm going to unseal evidence from a case 3 years ago. Rachel Montgomery versus Rivers Capital. Evidence that was ruled inadmissible but is still part of the court record. Once it's unsealed, it becomes public information. Journalists can report on it without legal consequences. Morgan looked at Rachel, who'd gone pale. You can do that. I can do whatever I want. I'm retiring. What are they going to do if fire me? Judge Winters laughed bitterly. But this system is broken, Miss Blake. Men like Rivers have corrupted it from the inside. Someone needs to fight back. Might as well be you. Why are you helping me? Because I have a daughter your age. She's a software engineer. Every time I sentenced someone like you, I imagined her in that defendant's chair. I imagined some man stealing her work and me being powerless to stop it. Her voice cracked. I can't fix the past, but maybe I can help you fix the future. The call ended. Morgan stared at her phone, then at her team. We have an ally on the inside, a judge who's going to unseal evidence that proves Rivers Capital's pattern. When? Kate demanded. 2 days, right before TechCrunch. Morgan felt pieces clicking together. If the evidence is unsealed, journalists can report on it legally. That gives Kate ammunition to get major media interested. By the time we hijack the presentation, the story is already breaking. Evan was already typing. I can coordinate with the SEC. I still have contacts there. If they see unsealed court evidence of systematic fraud, they'll have to investigate. It protects them politically. And I can file the class action the same day, Charlie added through the phone. With the evidence, public, and media coverage building, judges will have to recuse themselves if they're compromised. We create too much attention for Rivers to control. Rachel stood, walking to the window. You understand, this ends my quiet life. Right? The moment this goes public, I'm in the crossfire again. We all are, Morgan said. But maybe this time we won't be fighting alone. They worked through the night. Morgan reverse-engineered Blake Innovations' presentation software, finding backdoors she'd built in during development. Rachel studied the conference center's floor plans, identifying weak points in their network security. Kate drafted press releases and coordinated with the journalist contacts. Evan compiled financial evidence into formats that news outlets could verify quickly. By dawn, they had a plan. Risky, complicated, dependent on dozens of things going right, but it was a plan. Morgan stood at the motel window, watching the sun rise over the bay. Somewhere in San Francisco, Derek was probably sleeping in her penthouse bed. Tom was probably planning his next acquisition. They thought they'd won, thought Morgan was beaten. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. I know what you're planning, so does Tom. You have 48 hours to stop, or your mother dies. Morgan's hands shook. She showed the message to the others. They're bluffing, Kate said, but her voice was uncertain. Are they? Morgan thought about her mother, confused and vulnerable, about Susan jumping off a bridge, about how far Rivers' capital had already gone. Evan pulled up tracking software. The text came from a burner phone, but it pinged off a cell towers near your mother's house. They were watching Elizabeth Blake. Maybe had already grabbed her. We have to stop, Rachel said quietly. Morgan, if they hurt your mother, then we make them pay. Morgan's voice was steel. She called Charlie. I need you to get my mother somewhere safe. Now, use cash. Don't tell me where. Just get her away from San Francisco. On it, Charlie said, already moving. Morgan turned to her team. They're trying to scare us into stopping, which means we're close to something they can't afford to lose. We don't stop, we accelerate. TechCrunch is still 3 days away, Kate protested. Then we move it up. We don't wait for Judge Winters to unseal the evidence. We release everything ourselves. Tomorrow, we go to every news outlet simultaneously. Flood the zone before they can react. That's suicide, Evan said. Without the unsealed court records, we're just whistleblowers making accusations. They'll sue us before the stories even run. Let them sue, Morgan said. We'll be in every newspaper, on every news channel. The story will be out there. They can't kill what's already public. Rachel nodded slowly. It's insane enough to work, or to get us all killed. Then we better make it count, Kate said, already calling her editor. They had 24 hours to prepare the exposure of the decade, 24 hours to compile evidence, coordinate media, and prepare for the inevitable counterattack. Morgan looked at Rachel's flash drive, at Evan's financial records, at Kate's investigative files. Years of crimes documented, billions of dollars stolen, dozens of lives destroyed. Tomorrow, the truth would finally see daylight, or they'd all disappear like Susan Rodriguez, and no one would ever know what happened. The next 30 hours blurred into controlled chaos. Kate worked her journalist network, convincing editors that the story was real. Evan refined financial documents into formats that news outlets could independently verify. Rachel coordinated with Charlie to move Morgan's mother to a safe house in Portland. And Morgan prepared the presentation that would either save them or destroy them. At 6 p.m. the night before their planned exposure, they gathered in the motel room for final preparations. Bloomberg is in, Kate announced, checking her messages. So is TechCrunch, The Verge, and NPR. They'll all publish simultaneously tomorrow at 10 a.m. The SEC is ready to announce an investigation, Evan added. I've given them enough evidence that they have to act or look complicit, Charlie called in. The class action lawsuit is filed and sealed. It'll be unsealed at 10 a.m. tomorrow, same time as the media stories. 43 plaintiffs demanding $2.6 billion in damages. Morgan pulled up her laptop screen, showing a presentation titled, How Rivers Capital Systematically Steals Companies from Female Founders. Slide after slide of evidence. Emails, Financial records, recordings, the faces of women whose companies had been stolen. This is it, Morgan said. Once we release this, there's no going back. Are you sure? Rachel asked. They'll come after us with everything, lawsuits, criminal charges, maybe worse. Morgan thought about her mother, safe in Portland, but confused about why strangers had taken her from her home, thought about her company, being run by Derek Sutton while he dismantled everything she'd built. Thought about Susan Rodriguez, who'd been in this exact position and chosen the bridge. I'm sure, Morgan said. Let's burn it down. They ordered pizza and went over the plan one last time. At 10 a.m., Kate would publish stories on 5 major news outlets. Evan would send evidence to the SEC and FBI. Charlie would unseal the lawsuit. Morgan would post the presentation on every social media platform simultaneously. By 10:30 a.m., the story would be everywhere. Impossible to contain. What do we do after? Rachel asked. When Rivers Capital comes after us. We go public. Morgan said, cameras, interviews. We make ourselves too visible to disappear quietly. Kate nodded. I've arranged for us to do a live interview with NPR at noon, then Bloomberg at 2 p.m., then a crash. The motel room door exploded inward. 3 men in black masks rushed in, not police, private security. Morgan grabbed her laptop, but one of the men ripped it from her hands. Another grabbed Kate. The third pulled out zip ties. Nobody move, he ordered. His voice was calm, professional. Tom Rivers sends his regards. They were forced to the ground, hands zip-tied behind their backs. The men moved efficiently through the room, gathering laptops, phones, flash drives, every piece of evidence. You can't stop this, Kate said. The stories are already written. The evidence is already sent. Is it? The lead man held up Kate's phone, showing an email. Your editor at Bloomberg just got a call from their legal department. Apparently, they've decided the story is too risky to run. Potential litigation. They're killing it. He showed them more phones, more emails. Every outlet backing out. Every journalist suddenly concerned about legal liability. How high? Evan started. Tom Rivers owns pieces of every major media company in America. Not enough to control editorial directly, but enough to make one phone call to one board member who pressures one editor. The man smiled under his mask. You really thought you could win? Morgan felt the crack inside her finally break. Not into despair, into rage. You're going to kill us, she said flatly. Like Susan Rodriguez. Susan jumped on her own, the man said. You'll jump on your own too. Tragic. Young entrepreneur. Overwhelmed by legal troubles, takes her own life. Her friends die trying to save her. Very sad. He was describing their murders like a story already written. Rachel was crying silently. Kate struggled against the zip ties. Evan had gone pale. Morgan closed her eyes, thinking about her father's words. You can do anything if you work hard enough. But hard work hadn't been enough. The system was rigged. The powerful protected their own. The men lifted them up, preparing to move them. To the bridge? Probably. Or somewhere else bodies could disappear. Then the motel room door, barely hanging on its hinges, moved again. Charlie Hayes stood there, no longer in her lawyer suit but in jeans and a tactical vest, holding a gun. FBI. Nobody moved behind her. A dozen federal agents poured in. The private security men dropped their weapons immediately, hands raised. Charlotte Hayes, FBI. Morgan's mind spun. Former FBI. I keep my credentials updated. Charlie directed agents to secure the room. And I called in a few favors when you told me to move your mother. Figured you might need backup. The lead security man was being handcuffed. Tom Rivers is being arrested right now, Charlie said, along with Derek Sutton, Vanessa Klein, and about a dozen others. Turns out when you send armed men to kidnap people, the FBI takes notice, especially when one of those people filed a report this morning describing exactly what you were planning. Morgan stared at Charlie. You knew they'd come. I suspected, so I prepared. Charlie cut through Morgan's zip ties. And I made sure every piece of evidence you compiled was already in FBI hands. The exposure might not be happening through media, but it's happening through federal indictments instead. Over the next hour, Morgan learned the full scope. Charlie had been working with FBI agents for weeks. building a case against Rivers Capital. Morgan's evidence had been the final piece. The media stories were secondary. The real attack was coming through federal prosecutors. By midnight, news broke. Tom Rivers arrested on 43 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Derek Sutton charged with embezzlement and wire fraud. Vanessa Klein charged as an accessory, and a dozen shell companies seized by federal authorities. Morgan sat in the FBI field office, giving her statement, watching her life's work vindicated through arrest warrants instead of news articles. "What happens to Blake Innovations?" she asked Charlie. "It's frozen as evidence right now, but the company's ownership transfer was fraudulent. Once the case is resolved, it reverts to you." "How long?" "Months, maybe a year." Charlie sat beside her. "But Morgan, you'll get it back. And more, Dopa. The FBI is seizing Rivers Capital's assets. Every company they stole will be returned to its rightful owners." Morgan thought about Rachel, about the other women, about Susan, who jumped before help arrived. "It's not enough," Morgan said quietly. "Tom Rivers goes to prison, but the system that let him do this for 15 years is still intact. Judges who took bribes, lawyers who helped him, all still operating." "Then we fix the system," Charlie said. "We testify, we name names, we burn the whole corrupt structure down. But first, we breathe." Morgan breathed. For the first time in days, she took a full breath without fear crushing her chest. "What about my mother?" she asked. "Safe in Portland. I've got agents watching her. We'll bring her home when it's secure." Morgan closed her eyes. Her company would come back. Her money would be restored. Her name would be cleared. But the cost, the trauma, the way trust had been shattered and faith in justice destroyed. She thought about the homeless veteran's words. "You're finally free." Maybe this was freedom. Not having nothing, but having nothing left to lose. And from that empty place, building something real. 6 months later, Morgan sat in a federal courtroom wearing a Navy suit Charlie had helped her pick out. The trial of Thomas Rivers had become the biggest corporate fraud case in a decade. Cameras lined the hallway outside. Journalists filled every spectator seat. Tom Rivers sat at the defense table, still impeccably dressed, still radiating confidence. But his empire was gone. Rivers Capital had been dissolved, its assets liquidated, 43 companies returned to their founders. Morgan had Blake Innovations back. But it was a shell now, gutted by 6 months of Derek's mismanagement. She'd spent the last months rebuilding from scratch, rehiring her core team, salvaging what technology remained. The prosecutor stood. "The government calls Morgan Blake." Morgan walked to the witness stand, raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth. She'd practiced this testimony for weeks with Charlie, but facing Tom Rivers across the courtroom, seeing his cold eyes watching her, she felt 14 again, small, powerless. "Miss Blake, the prosecutor began. "Can you tell the court how you first met Thomas Rivers?" Morgan took a breath and began. She told her story. Stanford dropout with a revolutionary idea. Tom Rivers providing seed funding and mentorship. His introduction to Derek Sutton, who seemed perfect. 5 years of manipulation leading to one morning where she signed away everything. She described discovering the theft, the systematic destruction of her life, the jail cell, the moment she nearly gave up. "And what made you decide to fight back?" the prosecutor asked. Morgan looked at the gallery. Rachel Montgomery sat there, next to 3 other women whose companies had been stolen. Heather Chen, Miranda Park, and in spirit, Susan Rodriguez. "Because surrendering felt like dying," Morgan said. "And I decided I'd rather live." Tom Rivers' defense attorney cross-examined aggressively, suggested Morgan was a bitter ex-lover, implied she'd mismanaged her company and blamed others, tried to paint her as unstable and vindictive. But Morgan had spent 6 months preparing for this. She answered calmly, precisely, backed by documents and recordings. When she stepped down, Tom Rivers whispered something to his lawyer. The lawyer objected. The judge overruled. Other witnesses followed. Evan Cross detailing the financial crimes, Kate Brennan presenting investigative evidence, Rachel Montgomery describing her own stolen company. But the most damaging testimony came from Derek Sutton himself, offered immunity in exchange for cooperation. Derek described the entire scheme, how Tom recruited him, how they identified targets, how they executed the thefts. Why target women specifically? The prosecutor asked. Derek looked uncomfortable. Tom said women were easier, more likely to trust, more conditioned to accommodate. He called it leveraging social conditioning for corporate acquisition. The courtroom went silent. Even Tom's lawyer looked uncomfortable. And how many times did you execute this scheme? The prosecutor asked. 14 times over 7 years, Derek admitted. Morgan was supposed to be my last. Tom promised me full partnership in Rivers Capital after I delivered Blake Innovations. Why was Blake Innovations so important? The AI security technology was worth billions. Tom had been trying to acquire it legally for years. When Morgan kept refusing and he sent me in to take it by force. Morgan watched Tom Rivers' face as his protege dismantled his defense. For the first time, Tom looked worried. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, Tom Rivers stood to hear the verdict. On count 1, fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On count 2, conspiracy, guilty. All 43 counts. Guilty. Tom Rivers showed no emotion as they led him away. But as he passed Morgan in the aisle, he leaned close. You think you've won, he whispered. But there are others like me. This system runs on what I did. You can't fix it by putting one man in prison. Morgan met his eyes. No, but I can start. Outside the courthouse, journalists swarmed. Morgan gave a brief statement, flanked by Rachel and the other victims. This verdict doesn't erase what was stolen from us, Morgan said. It doesn't give back the years we lost or repair the damage done, but it proves that fighting back is possible, that truth can win, and that women who build things don't have to accept having them taken away. The press conference turned into a rally. Other women came forward, sharing stories of stolen companies and silenced voices. By evening, #Rivers of Change was trending worldwide. Charlie pulled Morgan aside. You know this is just beginning, right? Tom's lawyers will appeal. The other conspirators still need to be prosecuted. This could take years. Then we'll take years, Morgan said. I'm not going anywhere. That night, Morgan stood in the empty offices of Blake Innovations, the company she'd built, lost, and reclaimed. The space felt haunted by what had happened here. Kate appeared in the doorway. I'm writing a book about this, all of it. Rivers Capital, the trial, the systematic targeting of female founders. Publishers are interested. Good, Morgan said. More people need to know. Rachel texted from Seattle, where she was rebuilding her medical device company. We won, but it doesn't feel like winning. Morgan understood. Victory was supposed to feel triumphant. This felt like surviving, like making it through a war, scarred and changed, technically alive but fundamentally altered. Her mother called from Portland, her memory improving now that she was off the drugs Tom had somehow gotten her prescribed. Morgan, is that you, sweetheart? They're saying on the news you won some kind of trial. Yeah, Mom, we won. I'm proud of you. Your father would be proud too. Morgan closed her eyes, letting herself feel it. Pride, relief, and underneath, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from fighting too hard for too long. She thought about Susan Rodriguez, about how close she'd come to that bridge, about all the women who'd lost this fight before her. This is for you, Morgan whispered to ghosts. We won. But Tom Rivers had been right about one thing. The system that enabled him was still intact. Judges who took bribes had retired quietly. Lawyers who helped had suffered no consequences. Corporate structures that rewarded theft remained unchanged. Morgan pulled out her laptop and started typing. Not a business plan this time. Something different. A manifesto. A call to action. A blueprint for protecting founders from predatory investors. She titled it, Building in Public, A Guide to Protecting Your Company from Corporate Theft. By morning, she'd written 40 pages. By the end of the week, she'd shared it freely online. Within a month, 10,000 founders had downloaded it. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But this time, Morgan Blake wasn't fighting alone. 1 year after the verdict, Morgan stood on stage at TechCrunch Disrupt. Not in the audience hijacking someone else's presentation, but as a featured speaker. Blake Innovations had been rebuilt from the ground up, stronger than before. When I lost my company, Morgan told the audience of 10,000 founders, I thought I'd lost everything. But I learned something important. You can't steal someone's knowledge. You can't take their experience. The real value wasn't in the company. It was in what I learned building it. The crowd listened silently. Many were women. Many had similar stories of almost being stolen from or actually being destroyed. Blake Innovations 2.0 isn't just a company, Morgan continued. It's a model. We're open sourcing our legal structures, our funding agreements, our protection mechanisms, everything we learned about preventing corporate theft. We're sharing freely. She clicked to the next slide. We're also launching the Morgan Blake Foundation, funded by the settlement money from Rivers Capital's liquidation. We'll provide legal defense for founders facing predatory acquisition attempts. We'll document corporate theft patterns, and we'll name names. The audience erupted in applause. After the presentation, Morgan met with Rachel, whose medical device company had secured new funding. How's it feel to be a tech hero? Rachel asked. Exhausting, Morgan admitted, but worth it. They walked through the conference, passing booths and presentations. Young founders pitched ideas. Investors wrote checks. The ecosystem that had almost destroyed Morgan was still operating, but with slightly more awareness now. Kate found them near the food court. My book hits shelves next week. Publishers Weekly says it's going to be a bestseller. Rivers of Theft. Morgan smiled. Catchy title. I interviewed 43 women for it. Their stories. How the system failed them. How some fought back and some didn't. Susan's sister wrote the foreword. Morgan felt the familiar ache. Susan hadn't lived to see justice, but maybe her story would protect others. Charlie appeared, no longer practicing corporate law, but running a nonprofit legal clinic. I've got 16 new cases, all women, all targeted by firms using the Rivers playbook. They're still doing it, Morgan asked. They never stopped. Tom Rivers was just one player, but now we know what to look for, and we have resources to fight back. That evening, Morgan returned to the penthouse she'd bought back from Derek's bankruptcy auction. It had been cleansed of memories, repainted and refurnished. Her mother lived with her now, her dementia manageable with proper medication and care. Elizabeth was in the kitchen making dinner when Morgan arrived. How was the conference, sweetheart? Good, Mom, really good. They ate together, talking about small things, Elizabeth's book club, the neighbor's new dog, normal life, miraculous in its mundanity. After dinner, Morgan stood on the balcony overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, the same view she'd had the morning she signed away her empire. But everything was different now. Her phone buzzed. An email from a young founder. Miss Blake, I think my investor is trying to steal my company. I don't know what to do. Can you help? Morgan replied immediately. Yes. Call this number. Ask for Charlie Hayes. Tell her I sent you. Another email. Another founder. Another call for help. The work would never end. Corporate theft was systemic, built into capitalism's foundations. Tom Rivers had gone to prison, but his methods had spread like a virus. But Morgan had built something too, a network of protection, a system of resistance. Founders helping founders, women refusing to fight alone. She thought about the homeless veteran who'd told her that nothing meant freedom. He'd been right. Losing everything had freed her from the fear of losing it. Now she could fight without that fear, could take risks, could stand up to power because she'd already survived the worst they could do. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Morgan Blake, a young woman's voice, shaking. My name is Jessica. I just signed documents my business partner gave me. He said they were insurance forms. But I think I just signed away my company. Morgan's heart clenched. Another one. Jessica, listen to me carefully. You're going to be okay. I'm going to help you. First thing tomorrow. We're going to. She talked Jessica through the immediate steps, securing evidence, finding a lawyer, protecting her technology, the same steps Charlie had walked Morgan through a year ago. When the call ended, Morgan stood looking at the city lights. Somewhere out there, another woman was discovering she'd been betrayed. Another empire was being stolen. Another founder was learning that the system wasn't built to protect her. But this time, that woman wouldn't fight alone. Morgan opened her laptop and added Jessica's name to the growing list. Founders she was helping, cases she was tracking, a network of resistance growing stronger every day. Tom Rivers had been right about one thing. The system ran on what he'd done. Predatory capital, theft disguised as business, power protecting power. But systems could be changed. Slowly, one founder at a time, one lawsuit at a time, one story at a time. Morgan Blake had lost her empire and built something better. Not just a company, a movement. And she was just getting started. 5 years after signing away her empire, Morgan Blake sat in a television studio preparing for an interview with 60 Minutes. Blake Innovations was now worth $3 billion, 10 times its value before the theft. But that wasn't why the cameras were here. "We're live in 30 seconds, the producer said. The interviewer, a journalist Morgan had admired for years, settled into her chair. "Ready." Morgan nodded. She'd told this story hundreds of times now, but it never got easier. 5 years ago, the interviewer began as cameras rolled. Morgan Blake signed documents that stripped her of everything she'd built. Today, she's not just rebuilt her empire, she's changed how Silicon Valley operates. "Morgan, thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. Let's start with the foundation. The Morgan Blake Foundation has helped over 200 founders fight back against predatory investors. What drives that work?" Morgan thought about Jessica, the woman who'd called her that night on the balcony. Jessica's company had been saved. She'd gone on to build $1 billion business, and she'd helped the next founder, who'd helped the next. "I couldn't save Susan Rodriguez," Morgan said quietly. "She jumped off the Bay Bridge before I knew how to fight back. But I can save the women coming after her. Every founder we help is Susan's legacy too." The interview covered the trial of Obama, the rebuilding, the systematic changes Blake Innovations had pioneered, transparent funding agreements, founder-friendly corporate structures, protection mechanisms that prevented the kind of theft Morgan had experienced. Some critics say, "You're making it too hard for investors to take necessary action when founders truly fail." The interviewer noted, "How do you respond?" "I say good," Morgan replied. "It should be hard to steal someone's life's work. If an investor can't succeed without predatory tactics, maybe they shouldn't succeed at all." After the interview, Morgan returned to Blake Innovations headquarters. The building was different now. A full floor dedicated to the foundation. Conference rooms named after the women who'd fought back. Susan, Rachel, Heather, Miranda. Charlie met her in the lobby. The Supreme Court just ruled on the Rivers appeal. Morgan's stomach tightened. Tom Rivers had been fighting his conviction for 5 years, using every legal maneuver imaginable. "They denied it," Charlie said, grinning. "It's over. Tom Rivers serves his full 40-year sentence. No more appeals." 40 years. Tom was 60. He'd die in prison. Morgan felt something settle inside her. Not satisfaction exactly, more like completion. "There's more," Charlie continued. "The ruling set a precedent. Corporate theft cases can now be prosecuted as racketeering, which means longer sentences and easier prosecution. We just changed the law." They walked to Morgan's office, where Kate was waiting with an advanced copy of her second book. "Building After Theft: How Women Reclaim Silicon Valley." Kind of a triumphant title, Morgan observed. "We earned triumphant," Kate said. "Look at what we built." She wasn't wrong. The Morgan Blake Foundation, Charlie's legal clinic, Kate's books and investigative journalism, Rachel's successful medical device company, and dozens of other women, all connected, all protecting each other. They'd built a network that was changing the ecosystem. Not perfectly, not completely, but measurably. Morgan's phone buzzed. Her mother, texting from the senior center where she volunteered now that her dementia was in remission. "Proud of you, sweetheart. Saw you on the news." "Thanks, Mom." Elizabeth had recovered more than anyone expected once they'd removed the drugs Tom's people had somehow gotten her prescribed. She still had memory issues, but she knew her daughter, knew what Morgan had accomplished. As the sun set over San Francisco, Morgan stood at her office window, the same view of the Golden Gate Bridge she'd had from the penthouse. But everything was different. Derek Sutton had gotten out of prison after 3 years, his cooperation earning him a reduced sentence. He tried to apologize once. Morgan had refused to see him. Last she heard, he was working in insurance sales in Nevada. Vanessa Klein had served 2 years. She'd written Morgan a letter from prison. Morgan had never opened it. The other conspirators had scattered, some in prison, some in disgrace, some had just moved on to new schemes in new cities. But the system had changed, slightly, incrementally, enough that the next Tom Rivers would find it harder to operate, and the next Morgan Blake would find it easier to fight back. Rachel called, "Turn on CNBC. You need to see this." Morgan pulled up the business network. A young entrepreneur was being interviewed, a black woman in her 20s with revolutionary clean energy technology. "I almost lost my company last year," the woman said. "Predatory investor. But I called the Morgan Blake Foundation. They connected me with lawyers, showed me what to look for, helped me restructure my ownership. I kept my company, and now we're about to go public." The interviewer asked, "What would you say to Morgan Blake if she was watching?" "I'd say thank you, and I'd say I'm paying it forward. My company's first investment will be in the foundation that saved me." Morgan's eyes burned. This was the legacy, not the billion-dollar company. This, women helping women, founders protecting founders, a network of resistance that grew stronger every day. Kate touched her shoulder. "You changed the world." "Morgan, we changed the world," Morgan corrected. "All of us," Charlie raised an imaginary glass, "to burning it down and building it better." They stood together, three women who'd survived a system designed to destroy them. Three women who'd refused to stay, destroyed. Morgan's phone buzzed one more time. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, then decided to answer. "Miss Blake, my name is David Martinez. I'm a founder in Austin. My investor just asked me to sign documents I don't understand. I'm scared. Can you help?" Morgan smiled. "Yes, let me tell you what to do." And as she walked David through the first steps of protecting his company, Morgan realized something. The crack inside her, the one that had formed when she'd lost everything, hadn't healed. It had transformed. Where there had been weakness, there was now strength. Where there had been fear, there was now purpose. Where there had been despair, there was now hope. She'd lost her empire and built something better, not just for herself, for everyone coming after her. Tom Rivers had been wrong about one thing. You could fix the system, not overnight, not completely, but one founder at a time, one lawsuit at a time, one story at a time. Morgan Blake had been destroyed and rebuilt herself stronger, and now she was building a world where that destruction would be harder to inflict, where the next woman wouldn't have to fight alone, where the next Susan Rodriguez might survive. That was the real victory. Not the money or the company or even the justice. The real victory was in the calling from scared founders who now had someone to call, in the network that caught them before they fell, in the system that was slowly, incrementally, painfully changing. Morgan looked at the Golden Gate Bridge glowing in the sunset, the same bridge where she'd once stood broken and alone, and she smiled. She'd built an empire, lost it, built it again, but the real achievement was what she'd built for others, a safety net, a warning system, a community of women who refused to let predators win. That was the legacy that mattered, and it was just beginning. Morgan Blake built a billion-dollar tech empire from nothing. Then one morning, she signed documents her husband handed her over coffee. Just routine paperwork. He said, within hours, she'd lost everything: her company, her money. Even her own mother didn't recognize her. He'd planned it for 18 months, destroyed her in 18 minutes. But here's what her husband didn't know: you can steal one's company, but you can't steal what they learned building it. And Morgan was about to become his worst nightmare. This is the story of how one woman lost everything and took down a billion-dollar theft ring. If you've ever felt powerless against someone more connected, more powerful, stick around. This one's for you. Hit subscribe. You won't want to miss how this ends. Trust me. The San Francisco fog rolled thick against the penthouse windows that Tuesday morning, swallowing the Golden Gate Bridge in gray. Morgan Blake stood at the kitchen island, her coffee cooling beside a stack of papers that would destroy her life. She just didn't know it yet. "Baby, you need to sign these before your board meeting." Derek Sutton appeared behind her, his cologne expensive and suffocating. His hand rested on her shoulder, fingers pressing just slightly too hard. "The lawyers need them filed today." Morgan flipped through the documents, squinting at the dense legal text. Amendments to marital property agreement, Revised asset distribution framework? Her head throbbed from last night's wine, the bottle Derek had insisted they share to celebrate her company's latest funding round. This is just updating our prenup, right? She reached for a pen, the Mont Blanc Derek had given her last Christmas, making sure Blake Innovations stays protected if anything happens. Exactly. His voice was honey smooth. You've worked too hard building that company. This just ensures nobody can touch it. Not even me. She should have read every word, should have called her lawyer, should have noticed how Derek's hand trembled as he passed her the pen, or how his eyes kept darting to the hallway where she could hear someone's heels clicking against marble. But Morgan was tired, bone-tired from 70-hour weeks, from fighting skeptical investors who thought a 32-year-old woman couldn't revolutionize cybersecurity, from proving herself in every room she entered. Derek had been her safe place for 5 years, the one person who believed in her when everyone else called her ideas crazy. She signed, page after page, her name flowing across signature lines in blue ink. Morgan Elena Blake. Perfect. Derek pulled the papers away immediately, slipping them into his briefcase. I'll drop these at the lawyer's office. You focus on crushing that presentation today. He kissed her forehead, and Morgan felt something cold against her skin. His lips were like ice. The hallway heels clicked closer. Vanessa Klein emerged, Derek's business partner, carrying her laptop and wearing Morgan's favorite Cartier bracelet, the one Derek said was at the jeweler for cleaning. Ready for our meeting. Vanessa's smile was sharp as broken glass. The car's waiting. Meeting, Morgan frowned. I thought we were meeting at the office. Change of plans. Derek was already moving toward the door. We'll talk later. Babe, congratulations on the funding. The door clicked shut. Morgan stood alone in the penthouse she'd bought with her first million, surrounded by furniture she'd chosen, staring at the coffee maker she'd programmed every morning for 5 years. Something felt wrong. The silence was too complete, like the moment before an earthquake when even the birds stopped singing. She shook it off, grabbed her bag, headed for the door of Blake Innovations, the company she'd built from nothing after dropping out of Stanford. The AI security software that protected half of Silicon Valley's biggest firms. Her baby, her empire. The traffic down Market Street was brutal as always. Morgan's phone buzzed with notifications, congratulatory texts about the funding round, meeting reminders, a calendar alert for her mother's doctor appointment next week, the routine digital noise of a successful life. She didn't notice the text from her bank. Account activity alert, large wire transfer initiated. By the time she reached Blake Innovations' sleek office building in Soma, the fog had burned off. California sunshine hit the glass and steel like a promise. Morgan waved at Jerry, the security guard who'd been there since day one. Jerry didn't wave back. He stood, face apologetic, hand raised. Ma'am, I need you to stop there. Jerry, it's me. I'm late for the board meeting. I know, Miss Blake.